Hey, I think video games are an interesting way to explore spaces that don't fully exist in other forms of media. I want to talk about it. Over the last year or so, I've been streaming licensed video games every Monday on my Twitch channel. It's definitely a weird time, but despite their reputation, I generally enjoy exploring the different worlds and interpretations within them. I could talk about licensed games forever, but they're only tangentially related to what I'm here to talk about today. Now, I'm not generally a big believer in exceptionalism in many forms of media. That is to say, I don't really believe that books are better than movies or movies are better than games. Everyone likes different things for different reasons, and each form has strengths and weaknesses associated with it. However, one thing that largely differentiates games from many other forms of media is that they're interactive and often exploratory. In a game, you as a player have far more agency than more linear media like a film or a book or a stage production. This means there's often a lot of opportunity to explore and see things in licensed games, especially their worlds, from different angles. When I do that, I think a lot about all the spaces in between that we've never seen before. Interpretive spaces is what I've come to call them. Let's talk about what I mean by interpretive spaces. We'll start where so many things start, looking at books. For those of you who don't know, a book is a series of words challenging you to use your imagination to interpret their vision of a world. In a book, an author doesn't really need to describe every single element of the layout and contents of a space in extreme detail. Much of it can either be implied to the audience or only certain parts need to be focused on. Your imagination sort of fills in all the gaps. When that story transitions to a visual medium such as film or theater, all those places that were originally left to the viewer's imagination have to, actually be built by someone. Someone then has to ask, okay, what do these places actually look like? And then build that. However, even in film, it's pretty common to get away with building and dressing only relevant parts of a location. The parts that need to exist on screen and the audience needs to experience. This way, directors can focus their efforts on specific angles, specific shots, specific details of the places. And there certainly can be more to location, such as a real-life set or a building, but it often doesn't matter as much as the audience will never experience all of it. Usually it's often implied to exist off camera or is never really experienced in full form by the viewer. But what then happens when you take this very linear medium where large swaths of the background are left up to interpretation or presented in a very finite way, and convert it into a form where the audience experiences more or less the entire space within it? In practice, level designers don't quite have the luxury as these more linear mediums do. When a level designer is building a world, they usually end up building all of it in a way an audience is going to experience it. And again, to be clear, this is not a judgment call saying games rule because they do that or whatever. It's kind of just a fact of development. I think that by simply being a more interactive media, it's understood that players are going to explore an area, wander around, and experience a space in its entirety. Any space a player explores that is built on the heels of a licensed property has to be designed and built to feel like a more complete space than something like a book or a film might. And this kind of creates an interesting situation where game developers end up being the ones who need to fully interpret these spaces, and in some cases being the first ones to present it to an audience, where other media based on franchises doesn't really need to. I don't know if there's a term for these sort of spaces, but I've just landed on calling them interpretive spaces. Spaces which by their nature had to be left to be interpreted by the original creators, which suddenly need to be built fully to accommodate being moved to a player agency exploratory medium such as games. I want to walk through some examples and just reflect on these places out loud because I think it's surprisingly common to see this in licensed games. So an interesting thing about these types of spaces is that virtually any game based on an existing property has them to some degree. Perhaps one of the more classic examples is Goldeneye for the N64. The first mission of the game is the dam level, where the player fights their way through the dam and completes various objectives within it. This level is based off the Vahdat dam in Switzerland, which is featured in the opening scene of the film. However, if you'll remember, that scene is like maybe a minute long. There's some establishing shots, Charles Bronson is running from something off screen, his stunt double Wayne Michaels jumps off the dam, and that's kinda it. You see one side of the dam, some establishing shots, a bit of the top of it, and it's over. As soon as the devs at Rare decided to put this sequence in their game, its fate was sealed. Now that the player could explore it, it meant they had to imagine what the rest of the area looked like. This included the interior of the dam, what the road leading into the dam looked like, what security it had, and so on. What was originally just a space left open to the viewer's imagination sort of had to become a fully realized space. Another example that's particularly strong for me is Hogwarts from Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. While all the Harry Potter games generally featured parts of the Harry Potter world that you've never seen, what fascinates me about this game was that you could simply walk around the entire grounds of Hogwarts. In fact, you could even fly around on a hippogriff and see it from every angle that you've never experienced it in the books or movies. For the first time, it's like fully rendered for you to see from pretty much every angle. And the developers were really detailed. There's bridges that I've never seen in the films, you can run underneath the bridges leading out of the grounds, you can walk through the tunnels that are inside the school's courtyards. There's a lot there. I mean, sure, there wasn't a lot to do in those places, but these imaginary spaces that the movies and books left you wondering about were filled out to completion. At least from my memory, it was the first time the entire castle of Hogwarts felt like a fully realized place you could experience completely yourself. I don't think much of this existed before the game came out. Like, obviously there were extensive models, concepts, and artwork created for the films that they could grab and use as reference material, but as a member of the audience, it wasn't something that you ever got to see in full until this moment. As a viewer, there wasn't really any way to know that Hogwarts had a dark courtyard within a sequence of buildings, or the direction of the Quidditch grounds in relation to the greenhouses, or showing connecting paths that led from one courtyard to the next. Unless you had access to production models, you probably wouldn't have been able to experience that. The development of the game necessitated interpreting those spaces for the user in full, bridging the gap between the linear movie version and a more physical spatial one. What began as a sequence of moments now became one continuous experience. Star Wars Battlefront is a series that I think has always played well into this interpretive space concept too. Many of their maps feature set pieces from the films, which is to be expected, but what's interesting is how they choose to actually interpret those spaces. Take Hoth for example. When filming Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back, artists may have had an idea as to how the area was laid out or what features were where. But as an audience of the films, we see a few shots of frozen tunnels and frozen tundra, but the whole layout is never really pieced together for us. We're never really shown one steady shot that details paths and connections of Hoth, but just disjointed sequences that ultimately illustrate us a sense of place. Sure, we've seen many slices of Hoth bread, but we have no idea what the whole loaf looks like. Does that make sense? Are bread analogies good? Do you like bread? Dr. Curtis Saxton, an author who did some really amazing early Star Wars technical breakdowns, wrote a really good analysis of the Battle of Hoth circa 2001 or so that outlines my point exactly. He's an astrophysicist, and shot by shot, he goes through and makes rough estimates and educated guesses at the angle, position, and movements of entities in the Hoth battle relative to one another. I think this really illustrates how, outside of what is explicitly shown, that the audience simply has no way of knowing what Hoth actually looked like as a place. Even people who could make very educated guesses had to do that, just guess. So when building Hoth in Star Wars Battlefront, developers would have had to use these sequences of Hoth that were shown, and piece together the spaces in between along with whatever source material they were provided with. What was initially a shot of a tunnel becomes a connection between two spawn points. Trenches built into the ground are now one of multiple fronts players could be defending. The approach path of AT-ATs and their engagement spaces were defined as actual place. I just think that's really cool. Like, through the nature of just building a game with cool worlds and set pieces, Hoth has sort of had to become a defined place with an established layout. Over time, it forms into something you can more or less experience from one end to the next. And even without a huge body of material to pull from, these sort of interpretive spaces still find ways to exist within licensed games by virtue of changing mediums. Charlotte's Web, for example, is a weird game. It was made by Blast Entertainment in 2006, and it's something.
Come here, you!
The gameplay has you basically running around the farm between points, avoiding farmers who basically just reset you when they catch you. It's not really much. The Charlotte's Web movie takes place on an open farm with understandably very little concrete space to speak of. It has a smokehouse, a barn, a farmhouse, and that's kind of it. The film doesn't have much in place of concrete layout, at least not like Harry Potter or Star Wars does. It's a character-focused movie that takes place on a relatively mundane farm. And unlike the movie, the game presents it in cohesively one complete location suited to the purpose of the gameplay. I mean, clearly it wasn't designed by pulling from a ton of reference material. The fences are in weird positions, there's hay fields that never existed in the film, the buildings are all akimbo, and there's clearly way more crazy farmers in the game than there's the movie. But I still think it's interesting how the designers sort of had to interpret those spaces to meet the needs of their gameplay, and also paint it as one full cohesive picture of this place to the audience who has never quite seen it in full from every angle before. Now you can go and experience the farm from Charlotte's Web yourself. And arguably, I suppose there is drawbacks to games building out these interpretive spaces. It does deprive us as viewers of a sense of creative interpretation. Now, instead of an audience being able to see parts of a world and creatively build the rest out themselves, they have a lot of the worlds defined for them. Instead of a viewer being able to simply imagine what Hoth looks like, now there's something that tells you what it is. Now, instead of a fan saying, "What if Hoth was X?" we have a corporation saying, "Hoth is X." Instead of just imagining the endless potential of Hogwarts, we now have a representation of the model telling us exactly what it is. It can make it harder to feel like you can stray from what's established as a viewer, and it does take some of the imagination out of building these spaces in your head yourself. And it can become harder creatively to stray from an established world and reinterpret it, the more it's defined by an official body over and over again. At some point, having a loose series of roughly defined parts is something that allows for us to carve our own interpretations into them. There's a paper by Mosselaer and Gualeni called Representing Imaginary Spaces, Fantasy, Fiction, and Virtuality, which touches on some of the differences between audience expectation and our ability to build and imagine virtual spaces. It has some great nuance on what it means to really explore virtual space compared to non-interactive ones, and speaks to some of the limitations that come with building a space out virtually. I thought it was interesting, so I included a link for it below if you want some further reading. With the sheer number of licensed games out on the market, I think this idea of interpretive space and what it means is something worth keeping in mind as we develop and consume media. It's pretty inspiring to think that every time we build a space as devs, it's often going to be the first time someone can experience it in full. I just think that's so powerful. I'm also curious to know what your favorite interpretive spaces you've experienced in the game are. And if you can't think of any, then I'd challenge you to take a few moments and think about all the places you've experienced in games that you've never quite seen in full, because those might actually be interpretive spaces too.